Hello folks, welcome to Chapter 12, Production and Growth.
Variations in the standard of living. Among countries, average income in a rich country like US, Japan, or Germany, about 10 times the average income in a poor country like India, Nigeria, or Nicaragua, whatever. Differences reflect a large difference in the quality of life, including like nutrition, housing, healthcare, life expectancy, and so on. But except with different countries, just within one country, over time, the US real GDP per person also grows. The growth rate was 2% per year for the past 100 years. Because of differences in growth rate, ranking of countries by income changes substantially over time. Poor countries are not necessarily doomed to poverty forever, like Japan. Japan's incomes were low in 1860 and are quite high at this moment. Rich countries still cannot take their status for granted. They may be overtaken by poor but faster growing countries. So nobody is safe and no countries will stay poor forever. What will cause that? It's the productivity. Again, back to our principles, the 10 principles. Productivity is the key determinant for the standard of living qualities. So a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services, which means productivity. Here, the productivity stands for Y. We already know that Y stands for GDP, and the L here stands for labors. So if Y over L, it means real GDP per capita, which also means when we mention the productivity, the definition of productivity, it still means the real GDP per capita. It not means the general, the whole GDP, but the real GDP per capita. That's the definition for productivity. Quantity of goods and services produced from each unit of labor input. Key determinant of living standards when a nation's workers are very productive, real GDP is large and incomes are high. Growth in productivity is the key determinant of growth in living standard. So when productivity means Y over L is the GDP per capita. Grows rapidly, so do living standard. And back to our chapter 10, the real GDP per capita, that's the main determinant of average person's standard of living, right? So if this one grow fast, then people or average person's standard of living will improve really fast. An economy's income is the economy's output. So income equals to output. A nation can enjoy a high standard of living only if it can produce a large quantity of goods and services. This is our short answer question in your first test. That only means the whole GDP, the whole real GDP, right? The whole real GDP means the quantity of goods or services or the stuff we produce, not the nominal money or something. Since the real GDP per capita or productivity is really important, that is going to determine the GDP growth rate for different countries. Think about what factors will influence the productivity. What will influence a country's productivity? Why America is going to be richer than some other countries like China, India, and why America's GDP today is higher than the GDP was in 60 years ago. What kind of factors will affect that? Well, first, two of them. First one is the physical capital. When we usually talk about capital, the first thing in our mind is the physical capital, the stock of equipment, the structure used to produce goods and services, like computers, like buildings. But in this chapter, or in our macroeconomics, when we talk about capital, it not only refers to the physical capital, but also the human capital. Both of these two are capitals, all right? So please do not get confused. But the most important thing is the physical capital. And we are familiar with this part. Physical capital per worker is used K, the whole capital, the whole physical capital within this country, and divided by the number of laborers in this country. That's the physical capital per worker. Productivity is higher when the average worker has more capital. That's really easy to understand. Like before, if we didn't have any machines, we did everything with our bare hands. So our productivity was really low. But today, when we have machines, computers, and so on and so forth, our productivity increased a lot. So I increase in K over over L, or physical capital per capita, causes an increase in productivity. And the second determinant is the human capital. Human capital, H. Knowledge and skills workers acquire through education, training, and experience. So when we talk about human capitals, we have three ways to acquire that or improve the human capital. They are education, training, and experience. All right? There are three ways to improve human capital. Human capital per worker, H divided by L. Productivity is higher when the average worker has more human capital. Still, it's easier to understand. Like for people who have higher education, their productivity should be higher than the people who only have lower or high schools levels, something like that, right? And that's also the reason why we want to go to college. We want to have more education. We want to have more human capital. In that way, we will have a higher productivity and have a higher wage. An increase in H over divided L causes an increase in productivity. Except capital, we also need natural resources, which is N here. Input into production that nature provides, like land, rivers, and mineral deposits. Natural resources per worker still is divided by L. Other things equal, more N allows a country to produce more Y. An increase in N over L causes an increase in Y over L. Think about some countries with abundant natural resources, like Saudi Arabia. That country has a huge amount of oil. So no matter how higher the productivity in that country, the average people's standard of living is pretty high than some other countries, just because of that country has a higher natural resources. But for some other countries like Japan, although Japan doesn't have a huge amount of natural resources, but the GDP or productivity in Japan is still pretty high. So which means the natural resources determines the productivity, but it's not, we'll say, like 100%. it changes by some other factors like capital, physical capital or human capital. And also the last one, which is the most important one, is the technological knowledge. We use A to stand for the technological knowledge. And here, when we talk about technological advance or technology, usually what's in our mind is something related to the computer, to the software or something like that. But in this case, the knowledge means the society's understanding of the best way to produce goods and services is the common knowledge. So when we talk about technological knowledge, or A here, it's not something related to the technology, related to the computer, but related to the common knowledge here. The definition for common knowledge is after one person uses it, everyone becomes aware of it. So for common knowledge, you can share it to others, like economics. If some experts or economists find out something, and that would be a common knowledge, which means all students could learn it at the same time. And this is the technological knowledge, and this is A here. Proprietary is known only by the company that discovers it. Any advance in knowledge that boosts the productivity and allows the society to get more output from its resources. And all of them is the definition for technological knowledge. Again, it's the knowledge. For technology here, for A, is the knowledge. Since for the knowledge, we talk about that in A, but for human capital, we still talk about the knowledge, right? For education, we learn something, we get training. Still, that's the knowledge we learn. What's the difference? For technological knowledge, that refers to the society's understanding of how to produce goods and services. So for the technological knowledge, or for A, that's like a general meaning, which means there is some knowledge that could share among all human beings. That's A. That's you can acquire really easily. But for human capital, that's just for individual part. Result from the effort people expend to acquire this knowledge. Although there is A over there, the technological knowledge there, you can learn it, but you can still choose to not learn it. If you are going to need it or to learn it to get the training, is decided by every individual. So if one individual learn that, then the human capital for that specific individual will increase. That's the difference between the technological knowledge and the human capital. For A, that's the society's understanding. That could be shared among all human beings. But for the human capital, that's just for individual. If that person learn or get educated in college, then that's the individual choices. That's the difference between these two, and both are important for productivity. So how to distinguish these two is kind of important. The next part is the production function. Production function Y equals to A times F of L, K, H, N. Remember, L stands for labor, K stands for physical capital, and the H stands for natural resources. For human capital, and the N stands for natural resources. A graph or equation showing the relation between output and input. So F is a function here that shows how inputs are combined to produce output. A is the level of technology. Again, A is the technological knowledge, right? It should be the knowledge. A multiples the function F, so improvement in technology allows more output to be produced from any given combination of inputs. That's the definition for this equation, but another thing I want to emphasize here is for labor, physical capital, human capital, and natural resources. All of these are inputs for the production. So all of these four elements should be inside of this F. A is outside of this F, which means A, the technological knowledge is the most important factor. If A improve, no matter if there is limited resources you need, like labor or any capital, your final GDP, your final result will increase by a huge amount. So A here, it should be outside of this F. It's not input, but it will influence Y or GDP a lot. That's what you need to remember for this equation. Constant returns to scale. So changing all inputs by the same percentage causes the output to change by the same percentage. That's the constant returns. If inputs increased by or decreased by some percentage, your output, your final result, changed by the same amount of percentage. That's called the constant returns. So in this function, the production function is the constant returns to scale. If we doubling all inputs, again, when we talk about inputs, it's not including in A. It's not include the technological knowledge. The inputs only include the labors, how many labors we need to put in, we need to hire, and how many capitals we need to rent, and what's the human capital, so what's the education for our employees, what's the education level for our laborers, and how many natural resources we need to put to produce our products. All right. So these four are inputs. If we multiply all inputs, labor, physical capital, human capital, and the natural resources by 2, which will cause our final result. But the assumption here is our technological knowledge doesn't change. Our A doesn't change. If the time period doesn't change, usually the A will not change, because at this moment, our general knowledge will not change too much. So for some specific period, A will not change. If we double our inputs, our output will double as well. Which also means increase all inputs by 10%, or multiplying each by 1.1 causes output to increase by 10%. So if double our inputs, we will double our outputs. If we increase all of our inputs by 10%, our output will also increase by 10%. And this causes constant returns to scale, all right? Which means if the input increases by some percentage, the output will change by the same amount of percentage. That's the constant return to scale. Since we already know that the production function is the constant returns to scale, so what we can do here? Let's go back to the next slide. I'm going to write it in the blackboard. Times L, D, H, and N. This is constant returns of scale. So if we divided every input, divided every input by L, by the labor. So A divided by L, H divided by L, N divided by L. If all of our inputs divided by L, then because it's the constant scales of return, constant returns of scale, so our output will also divided by L, right? Decreased by the same amount. That's the definition of constant returns to scale. So in this case, if we divided all inputs by L, then our output is multiplied by 1 over L, which means that this term, L over L, will equal to 1 here. Then in some questions, you will not see this label here in the questions like this, or expressions like this. You will not see 1 there, just because 1 here is just a number, a constant number. So you do not need to include a number in your equation, right? Or in your expression. So sometimes you will see this expression, but sometimes you may see this one. I deleted 1 just because L over L or labor over labor is equal to 1. All you need to do just leave the unknown numbers or x, y, z in the equation, in the formula, and leave all the other numbers outside of this f expression. This equation shows that productivity Y over L, output per worker, depends on the level of technology, physical capital per worker, human capital per worker, and the natural resources per worker. Again, the level of technology, A here, is the most important one. That will influence the productivity amount. And all the others will increase the productivity as well. Economic growth and public policy. A society's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. That's real GDP, right? If there is a higher real GDP, the society's standard of living will increase. Productivity depends on physical capital per worker, human capital per worker, natural resources per worker, and the technological knowledge. Productivity here is the real GDP per capita. So these two are different. That's the real GDP and that's the real GDP per capita. It should be all inputs will be per worker, except this technological knowledge, or A, because A is outside of that expression, outside of that. So policymakers, what can government policy do to raise productivity and the living standard? Since productivity is really important for GDP, for the real GDP, and every country wants to improve their people's standard of living. So I think all governments, what they want, just improve their own productivity, right? Compared with other countries. What things the government could do to improve its own country's productivity? First one, saving and investment. To raise the future productivity, encourage saving and investment. Invest more current resources in the production of capital, K. Producing more capital means producing fewer consumption goods. So imagine when we produce some product, that's our real GDP within our country. But our GDP could divide it into consumption and also divide it into investment, right? So for the same resources, if we want to consume more stuff, which means I'm going to left fewer resources to invest, to produce in the future. You can also think like this. I have some income, and I can choose how many amount of my income I'm going to use to for consumptions. And except the consumption part, that's the saving part. What I'm going to do with my saving? Maybe I prefer to invest it to get more profit in the future, right? So that's human beings' choice, and that's also the government or society choice. And also, for your investment, you should have some savings first. Usually, saving equals to investment. And how much saving you are going to increase is also equals to the deducting of consumptions. That is still the trade-off. That's the principles of our economics, right? If I want to save more, of course, I need to control my shopping. This actual saving funds the production of investment goods. So if I want to invest something, before that I have to have some savings. I need to have some money to invest. So for the government, if the government wants to improve the productivity, the better way is to invest more to get more capital, physical capital in the future for the future's production. And if the governments want to invest more for physical capital in the future, the government have to have some savings before that. Or the government have to encourage all citizens to save some money and use that amount of money to invest for future capital or physical capital, and which will raise the future productivity. Good. Next part is diminishing returns. Policies that raise savings and investment. Fewer resources are used to make consumption goods. Again, if you want to have more savings and use that amount of savings to invest, what you need to give up, the trade-off, is to consume fewer products today. More resources to make capital goods. K increases. If you consume fewer today and invest more today, which means your physical capital will increase today, and that will rising productivity and the living standard in the future. This faster growth is temporary due to diminishing returns to capital. As K rises, the actual output from an additional unit of K falls. What's the definition for this sentence? Let's see one picture here. So if workers have little K, giving them more increase their productivity a lot. So let's see here. You can see the productivity curve is a concave curve, it's not straight line. You can imagine something like this, such as for me, I'm an instructor here. If you give me a computer, I can improve my quality. Like I can speed up my speed. I can speed up my speed. Like I do not need to write everything on the blackboard, so I can share more materials in the class. That increases my productivity. But if you give me 2 computers in my class, for the 2 computers, maybe I still can improve my productivity. Like for one computer, share my slides. For the other computer, share the homework assignments. But the productivity will not increase by a huge amount. Maybe just increase by a smaller amount. And that's the definition here. That's the reason why the relationship between physical capital per labor and the real GDP per capita, the relationship is positive, but the production curve or function is concave curve. When the capital per labor is small, then if I give some amount of more capital per person, the increase of productivity will be higher. But when the K over L is already high compared with the original point, and increased by the same amount of K over L, the green arrow and the red arrow, you can see the vertical axis, the real GDP per capita or the productivity or Y over L only increased by a smaller amount compared with the vertical green arrow, right? So that's the definition of diminishing returns. And that's not only for capital per worker, but also for the human capital, for the natural resources. The more inputs, of course, I'm going to produce more output. Like increase by 10%, I'm going to increase by 10%. But the results will diminish. If workers have little K, giving them more increase their productivity a lot. So compared with higher K over L or smaller K over L. If workers already have a lot of K over here, giving them more increase here, the same amount, but the productivity only increased by a smaller amount. That's the definition of diminishing returns. The catch-up effect. So just because of the diminishing returns, we have some catch-up effect. Definition for catch-up effect is the property whereby countries that start off poor tend to grow more rapidly than countries that start off rich. You can think about the difference between China and America. Like 60 years ago, America was much richer than China. But at this moment, the GDP growth rate in China is higher than America. In that way, the real GDP in China grows faster than America. That's just because of the catch-up effect. Because 60 years ago, the physical capital per worker or the human capital per worker in China was too low before in 60 years ago. In that way, gave China the same amount of resources as the US. The growth rate for China will be really fast, right? So that's the catch-up effect. In 1960 to 1990, the US and South Korea similar share of GDP developed to the investment, except similar growth performance. So growth rate was over 6% in South Korea and only 2% in the US. The same example as China versus the US, right? The catch-up effect in 1960, K over L, was far smaller in Korea than the US. Hence, Korea grew faster. So, also back to this picture. Use this diminishing returns, so we can talk about different people's productivity. Like for two persons, for two people, one has smaller amount of capital before. The one already has a huge capital today or before, and they give them the same amount of capital. For the person who has or who had a smaller amount of capital, that productivity will increase by a huge amount than the person who already had a huge amount of capital before, right? You can compare that with people. And also you can use that definition for countries. For poor countries, give that country the same amount of resources as the rich country, and the GDP growth rate for the poor country will grow faster. So you can use this picture to explain two things, people and countries. So for poor country, starts over here, and for rich country, the physical capital per worker is already huge here. for each country. I give them the same amount of resources, more. For poor country, the growth rate is much higher or bigger than the rich country's growth rate. That's how we use diminishing returns to explain what happens in the real world. So, except the investment within the country, that the government could encourage citizens to save more, to invest more, and have future higher productivity. Except the domestic investment, the investment also could come from the other countries, from abroad. Another way for a country to invest in a new capital, two ways. The first is a foreign direct investment, which is the capital investment that is owned and operated by a foreign entity. Like for foreign company, if that company want to build a new factory in Mexico, and that would be the direct investment. Build, buy, no matter rent or buy a new plant and build a new assembly line and build new cars over there. That's the direct investment. And the second way to invest is the investment from abroad, is the foreign portfolio investment. And that is the investment financed with foreign money but operated by the domestic resident. Remember, for the example of foreign companies, for that company, the direct investment is that company is going to use their own money to buy a new factory in another country. And in that case, for the foreign company, can do all the decisions by themselves, like to increase the productivity, decrease the land, or fire some laborers. All decisions could be decided by the foreign company. So that's the direct investment. But for the foreign portfolio investment, that is different. That's just you can buy some bonds, buy some stock owned by another company. Like as an American, you can buy like a stock of Mexican companies. In that way, you can own some part or some share of that company, but you cannot decide what that company is going to do, right? So the amount of money for an American to buy a stock or share of ownership of the foreign companies, like a Mexican company, that would belong to the portfolio investment. So I think an easier way to distinguish the two is if you can make decision. Or for portfolio, just the bonds, the stocks, something like that, right? That's the portfolio investment. That's how I distinguish these two investments. Next part, some benefits from investment from abroad. So the first benefit is some benefits flow back to the foreign capital owners. That's easier, right? Such as for direct investment for the foreign company to invest there. Of course, the aim for that company just to get some profit, because maybe the labor force there is cheaper, so more profit that the owner could earn. And also, such as for you to invest in Mexican corporations, like to buy a stock there. What you want just to get some benefit, right? If the price of that stock increase, then you will have some benefit from that stock. That's the first one. And the second, increase the economy's stock of capital. Again, for either direct investment, imagine such as the foreign company in Mexico. If a foreign company builds new factories in Mexico, then they are going to spend some money, right, to buy some machines over there. And that will increase the stock of capital in Mexico. And for the indirect investment or the portfolio investment, the same. If you buy Mexican's company stock, and in that case, that company will have more money, right? Because you buy some shares, some company shares of that company. So that company will have more money, and they can decide how to spend that money. Usually, they are going to expand their plant or factories to get more profit, to produce more. So no matter direct investment or portfolio, both of them is going to increase the economy's stock of capital. Because more money, they can buy more physical capital. 3, higher productivity and higher wages. The same, if there are more money in that country, no matter from the domestic investment or foreign investment, more employers means more money and more demand for the laborers within the country. The wage will be higher, and more capitals means higher productivity. State-of-the-art technologies developed in the other countries. Still, for the Ford company, since the maybe structure or some technological advance or knowledge for Ford company is really advanced, and when that company build a new factory in Mexico, of course the new knowledge will happen there. And the workers, the laborers who work there is going to learn some new structures, some new management strategies or something like that, right? The last one, especially good for poor countries that can't generate enough savings to fund investment projects themselves. It's easier to understand for poor countries, but it's still some case for rich countries like America. Although America is really rich, but Americans do not save a lot. In that case, lots of foreign companies is going to directly invest in the United States. So, but especially usually just for poor countries. They do not have savings, so foreign companies are going to invest there to get more profit. So that's all benefits from the investment from abroad. Education. Okay, education equals the investment in human capital. Remember, when we talk about human capital, the difference between the technological knowledge is for human capital is the individual. It includes education, training, and experience. So if we want to investment in human capital, usually we should increase the education or enhance the education. The education is the gap between wages of educated and uneducated workers. And that's the reason why we want to go to college to learn more. Opportunity cost of education, the wages forgone. And we have learned, or we have seen these questions in chapter 1 a lot, right? Like in chapter 1, some questions like if you go to college, what's your opportunity cost? Usually the opportunity cost will include the wage you could earn if you work during that time. First, the positive externalities. In this part, we can imagine if you talk with a higher educated person and you can learn more than you talk with an uneducated worker or person, right? Because again, for education, that's knowledge, but for individual. If a higher educated worker or laborer have a higher education or school level, which means they are going to learn more. They have a sophisticated knowledge or something. They could give you more ideas, so positive externalities. The last one, subsidies to human capital investment, public education. Not options. This should be the aim for all governments, right? For all governments, if they want to increase the productivity, they have to subsidize the education. They have to supply as more as education to all citizens. In that case, that will increase the human capitals in that country and result in a higher productivity in that country. Problems for poor countries, the brain drain. So the immigrations of many of the most highly educated workers to rich countries, where these workers can enjoy a higher standard of living. But that's bad for poor countries, since the poor countries don't have enough money to supply the good education, healthcare, the environment, and for all educated or higher human capital workers, they prefer to live for a higher standard of living and do more or higher productivity. People will go to the rich country from the poor countries. So that's really bad for poor countries. So for human capital, except to increase the education, to improve the education within the country, the other thing the government can do is to improve the health and increase the nutrition for the citizens. Healthcare expenditures is a type of investment in human capital. Healthy workers are more productive. That's easier to understand. If I'm healthy, then I can share more information during class. But what if I'm sick? I cannot speak clear. I cannot think clear. And I do not want to do lots of stuff. So which means my productivity here will be really low, right? So in countries with significant malnourishment, rising workers' caloric intake raises productivity. In 1962 to 1995, caloric consumption rose 44% in South Korea, and the economic growth was spectacular. Nobel winner Robert Fogel, 30% of Great Britain's growth from 1790 to 1980 was due to improved nutrition. Again, in this part, you should understand that to improve human beings or human capitals, you have two ways. First is provide them a higher education or better education, and another way is improve their nutrition and health. For rich countries, they have huge, as general, they have huge higher real GDP. They have high real GDP, which means they can afford more educations, more health care, so on and so forth. Give healthier food, something like that, which will increase the productivity in that country, right? But for poor countries, since they do not have enough resources to build the education system or provide health care to all their citizens or healthy food, in that case, the productivities will be lower in those countries. If the productivity higher in rich country, which means the rich country will become richer. But if the poor country cannot afford higher education or healthcare, good healthcare, which means lower productivity will result the poor country get poorer. That's kind of like a circle. So vicious circle in poor countries. Poor countries are poor because their population are not healthy, and the population are not healthy because they are poor and they can't afford better health care and the nutrition. Virtuous circle, policies that lead to more rapid economic growth would naturally improve health outcomes, which in turn would future or further promote economic growth. That's the virtuous circle and the vicious circle. Property rights and political stability. Okay, again, the first question is what government could do to improve our productivity, right? And the further thing we learn is the investment. For investment, the government can improve the domestic investment, which means the government's policy should encourage all citizens to save more money and use that amount of money to invest for future productivity or physical capital. In that case, what government could do is to decrease the tax break or give a tax break for companies, right? To encourage them to invest more, or give consumers or citizens some tax exempt for invest or for savings. In that way, the residents are going to save more because they can avoid some tax, and to save more, to invest more. The second way is the foreign investment. What government can do is to lower the tax rate or give tax break, not only for domestic citizens, but also for the foreign companies to attract more investment from other countries. The second thing the government could do is give all citizens better education and higher health care. The third thing the government could do is have property rights and political stability, because that's also very important for productivity. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activities. Back to our chapter 4, because we have demand curve and supply curve, in an economy market, that would be the perfect way to allocate our resources. But there are still some market failures there, right? But here it's kind of the same. To foster economic growth, the government should protect the property rights, the ability of people to exercise authorities over the resources they own. Such as I invent something, I should protect my patent. In that case, I'm going to invent more stuff and improve the technological advance in this country, right? If I invent something and other people could steal it really easily, which means I have no incentive to invent any new things more further. So in that case, that will decrease the productivity within this country. So what government need to do is to protect the property rights. Prerequisite for the price system to work and the court force property rights. And the second thing is promote the political stability. That is also easier to understand. What government want is to have a higher investment. And for investment, not only from the domestic, but also from the foreign companies or countries. So think about if the country's if one country that political stability is not stable, for foreign companies, they prefer to not invest. They do not want to invest in that country, right? Some if there is more criminals. If there are some corruptions over there, so the opportunity cost would be so high in that country. In that case, nobody is going to invest there. That's for investment. And also for the human capital. Foreigners will not go to there. But for the domestic citizens, they prefer to leave that country because of corruptions, because of criminals. So if human capitals leave that country, the productivity in that country will also decrease. So, what government should do here? First, foster the protect the property rights, and second, have a stable policy or promote the political stability. Major problem: lack of property rights. So contracts are hard to enforce, fraud corruption often goes unpunished. Firms must bribe the government official for permits. That's what I talked about before, right? If that happens, then no firms want to go to that country to invest or to run their own company there. And the same for the political stability. No matter for people or for firms, they prefer certainty. If they have no idea what their future would be in that country, if the opportunity cost is too high in that country, then nobody will go there. So the free trade. Trade can make everyone better off. There are two different policies for trade. The first is inward-oriented policies, aimed to raise living standards by avoiding interaction with other countries. The example for the inward-oriented policies are tariffs, limits on investment from abroad. And another policy is the outward-oriented policies. And of course, the second one is better. The outward-oriented policies promote integration with the world economy. And the example for that policy is the elimination of restriction on trade for foreign investment. So in this part, you need to remember there are two kinds of policies, and we are going to learn them in details. What's the difference between these two and why? Which one is better and which one is worse? Trade has similar effect as discovering new technologies. So we are going to talk about this part later. And because trade can improve productivity and the living standard. The second reason is, or the second thing you need to remember is countries with inward-oriented policies have generally failed to create growth. For inward-oriented policies, they are not good at promoting or improving the GDP growth. For example, Argentina throughout the 20th century. So usually the countries or the landlocked countries, it's really hard for them to trade with others because it's hard for them to communicate with others before. But at this moment, it's much better for, through the internet or everything, airlines, airplanes, or whatever, right? But before, only with the ship and cars, something like that, it's really hard for the landlocked countries to communicate or trade with other countries. Countries with outward-oriented policies have often succeed. So, such as South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. These countries are outward-oriented policies. And the countries with natural seaports find trade easier than those without this source. Think about the England, the UK, the US, right? The Australia, the Canada. Lots of countries, lots of developed countries really have the natural seaports. Let's jump into the first one. Why the trade has similar effect as discovering new technology. Remember, this is the example we have learned before, or that's the question during the class. I asked you how to calculate the opportunity cost in this table, right? And the original question is for you. If you use all of your time to pick apples, you can pick 20 pounds of apples. If you are going to use the same amount of time to pick cherries, then you can pick 20 pounds of cherries. And the same for your neighbor. If your neighbor used all of his or her time to pick only apples, your neighbor could pick 30 pounds of apples and use the same amount of time to pick cherries, could pick 60 pounds of cherries. So that's the green line. Those are the original PPF for you and your neighbors. In that way, if without trade, that's the PPF, and these four numbers are the opportunity cost. How to calculate the opportunity cost? Use currency divided by the product. That's what we learned in chapter 2. Now, after we find out these four numbers, we can compare the opportunity cost of picking 1 pound of apples. For your neighbor, the opportunity cost is 2 pounds, but for you it's only 1 pound, which means the opportunity cost for you compared with your neighbor is lower, which means you have a comparative advantage than your neighbor for picking up apples. And then compare of the opportunity cost of picking 1 pound of cherries. Of course, your neighbor's opportunity cost is lower than you. 0.5 is smaller than 1. So for your neighbor, the opportunity cost is lower, which means your neighbor has comparative advantage in picking cherries. In that way, so for you, you should use all of your time to pick apples, and your neighbor should use all of his or her time to pick cherries. If you use all of your time to pick apples, then 20 pounds. Your neighbor only pick cherries and 60 pounds. At this moment, the price for apple for you is the price of apple for you is 1 cherry per apple, right? And the price of apple for you neighbor should be 2 cherries per apple, because 60 over 30, which means the trade price between 1 and 2. Every price would be okay if the price is between 1 and 2, because for you the price is 1, for your neighbor the price of apple is 2. So the trading price between 1 and 2, that's fine. So any price between that, if you trade with your neighbor, then both of you will get better. What if the price is 1.5, which means 1 apple can trade for 1.5 cherries? Then for you, you have 20 pounds of apples. With that 20 pounds, you can trade for 30 pounds of cherries. So from 20 to 30, that red dashed line is your new PPF. And the same for your neighbor. Again, the price is 1 apple for 1 pound of 1.5 cherries. Your neighbor has 60 pounds of cherries, and with the price of 1.5, that's equals to 40 pounds of apples. With that trading price 1.5, this red dashed line is the new PPF for your neighbor. And again, after trading, both you and your neighbor's PPF move out, right? Remember, we talk about the PPF. There are 2 ways to move PPF outside. The first way is the technological advance. The second is improve or give more resources. Here, we do not have more resources. We just have you and your neighbor, and with the same amount of time as before. And only one reason, I talk about in chapter 2, to move your PPF outside like this way, is the technological improvement or technological advance, right? And only move one part, not both parts. It's the technological advance in only one industry. That's what we learned in chapter 2. And in this one, except the technological advance or more resources, the trade could also improve your PPF. And this movement is kind of the same as discovering of new technologies. So that's the reason why trade has similar effects as the discovering of new technologies. And it's kind of the same as the new or technological advance in only one industry. So the result for free trade is kind of the same. If new PPF moved outside. So except capital, the human being, that's the third one, the free trade. The next one is research and development. What government can improve is A. Remember, A is the most important thing because it's outside of that I expression. If A improve, that will improve the general productivity. So technological progress is the main reason why living standards rise over the long run. And the knowledge is a public good. Ideas can be shared freely, and increasing the productivity of many. Remember, the difference between A and H is the knowledge for A is the technological knowledge that's free, that can share among all human beings. And human capital, that's education, that knowledge just for individual. So here, if we talk about A, the research and development, that should be the knowledge can share freely among human beings. What government can do to improve the technological knowledge or research and development? Usually there are three ways here. First is patent laws, and it's kind of the same as the property rights. You should protect the property rights for others, and they have the incentive to improve or to do more research, to develop or invent more ideas. The second strategy would be the tax incentive or direct support for private sector R&D. And the third one is grant for basic research at universities. Usually there are three ways for governments to do to improve A, the technological knowledge. And also because America is good at these three parts. And, remember the definition or the term brain drain, right? Some people is going to immigrate to some countries which could protect them, either their safety or their knowledge. So just because America is good at these three policies, and then America is the opposite of the brain drain, and that's also the key advantage of the United States. Next part is the population, is the L. Again, back to the equation. The productivity equals to A times F of L. L is the first term, right? That's the input. So which means labor, the large population is really important for productivity or for the whole GDP, the real GDP. The large population, more workers to produce goods and services. Large total output of goods and services, which means the large population only improve the real GDP, not the real GDP per capita, the total amount of stuff or total amount of goods and services that country produce. And the country with a large population, usually they have more consumers. They are going to buy more stuff. So for this case, I think China is a typical case. China has a huge amount of population and more workers, more real GDP, but not real GDP per capita. Population growth may affect living standards in three different ways. So there are three different ways. First, two of them are the disadvantage, and the last one is the advantage. We are going to look at them in details. The first disadvantage is stretching natural resources. 200 years ago, Malthus argued that population growth will strain society's ability to provide for itself, and mankind will doomed to forever live in poverty. So 200 years ago, lots of countries or governments believe this strategy. And today, recently, since then, the world population has increased sixfold and the living standard increased, which proved that the Malthus' idea was wrong. So why his idea was wrong? Just because the Malthus failed to account for the technological progress and the productivity growth. And this is the first disadvantage for the large number of population, because it will strengthen the natural resources. And the second disadvantage is diluting the capital stock. With a high population growth, which means a large or higher L, right? L is the labor force or the workers. It will spread the capital stock more thinly. If we have a fixed amount of capital, the physical capital K there, if we have a huge amount of population, which means the physical capital per labor will decrease, has a lower K over L. And in that case, if K over L is decreased, remember that diminishing returns or that concave curve. If we have smaller amount of K over L, then the productivity in that country will decrease. So lower productivity and the living standard if we have a huge amount of people, which is going to dilute the capital stock and result in a lower capital productivity in that country. Many developing countries' policy. So just because of the first two disadvantages, some governments merged with some ideas like China. The government's regulation, China's one-child law, happened between 1980 through 2015. And that's also what Chinese government did, is increase the awareness of birth control. The third one, the first two are easier to understand. That's easier to control the population. And how about the third one? Equal opportunities for women. Promote female literacy to raise the opportunity cost of having babies. Why the third one is also going to control the population. Think about this. If for women, the average birth age is 20 years old. And then within 100 years, for the average women's birth age, they could birth like 5 generations. But what if promote women's raise the opportunity cost of women to having babies? After that, the women's average birth age would be increased from 20 years old to 25 years old, and still within 100 years and only 4 generations in this country. So if improve or increase the average women birth age, then you are going to decrease 1 generation. And in that way, it will decrease the total population within that country. And also, beyond these two, another reason the government do not want its country, before, the countries didn't want their countries to have a huge population. It's because the more population, which means more children, right? And the more children, the government need to spend a huge amount of money on education. So for poor countries, they do not want to spend too much money on education, or they cannot afford that education systems. And that's another reason that government didn't want a huge population before. But the third one would be the positive or advantage for the huge population. That's the promoting technological progress. Because world population growth, that's the engine for technological progress and economic prosperities. More people, more scientists, more inventors, more engineers, which means more frequent discoveries. You should remember this part, right? This is a good part for the large population. The huge amount of population is going to promote or improve the technological advance. Michael Kramer, Human History. Growth rate increased as the world's population increased. And the more populated region grow faster than less populated ones. And this according to the human history. So for this part, what you need to remember is for population, for L, for the labor force, there are three factors. Two of them are disadvantage. One is stretching natural resources. The second one is diluting the capital stock. And the third one is the good one, is the advantage. That is the promoting technological progress. That's the question here. Why is so much of Africa poor? How to answer this question? Because in this chapter, we have learned the most important thing is the productivity and what factors influence the productivity and different elements in different factors, right? So just according to what you learn in this chapter to figure out what kind of reasons could explain this. Okay, let's see the answer together. Here, you can see all of them are the determinants we talked before, right? Remember, when we talk about productivity, and it's related to physical capital, the human capital, the natural resources, and A. So according to the answer here, the low capital investment, that's related to K, right, the physical capital. And what government did or didn't do for that, maybe didn't encourage the savings or investment, something like that. And for the second and third one, that's the human capital. That could happen. For the fourth one, that's the labor force, the high population growth. Remember, there are three elements or factors for the huge population, the population growth rate, whatever. And the first two are the negative part, and the last one is the positive. So the high population growth rate could be if for Africa, they do not protect the property rights or encourage the R&D, then the higher population or the large amount of population will result to a poor economy. That's how population growth rate and geography disadvantage. The sixth is also kind of the same because of the government's policy. The 7 and the 8 are the political stability. If the government is not performed well, phenomenon that will cause the brain drain, right? But that's the phenomenon. What causes that could be these two. So that's how you should answer the short answer question, at least for the macroeconomics.